Mic check. 1, 2. Are we recording? Hi, I'm Michelle Bernstein, an award-winning chef, restaurateur, and mom. I have a lot on my plate, including my psoriatic arthritis symptoms. That's why I was prescribed Cosentyx. It helps me move better.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for people 2 years of age and older with active psoriatic arthritis. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com.
Ask your rheumatologist about Cosentyx.
Hey, it's Mandy Moore.
Sterling K. Brown.
And Chris Sullivan from That Was Us.
Spring is finally here. And if you're like us, you're looking for little ways to bring new energy into your home, starting with your bed.
I love everything about Brooklinen. I love the variety of colors. I love the texture. I love the coolness up against my skin. I'm a man who runs hot. These sheets keep your boy cool, and I love them.
Brooklinen makes it so easy to refresh your space with layers that feel light, breathable, and so comfortable. Finding sheets you love can be tricky, but Brooklinen nails it every time.
Brooklinen offers so many different tones and textures, which is great, since new colors can make your bedroom feel fresh and inviting. Plus, their lightweight, airy fabrics are perfect for sun-kissed mornings and cozy nights.
And the best part? Brooklinen has everything you need, from soft sheets to the perfect throw blankets to style and layer your bed effortlessly.
It's no wonder they have over 100,000 five-star reviews. People love them. So if you're ready to refresh your space, now is the time.
Shop award winners and fan faves in-store and online at brooklinen.com. That's BROOKLINEN.com. Get 15% off your first order today.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by University of Northern Iowa political scientist Justin Holmes.
Good morning.
Good morning, Justin. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, doing well, thanks. How are you?
I am doing okay. I'm extra caffeinated. I don't know if that's going to be for good or for ill, but I guess we'll find out here in just a minute. But before we do get into what we're going to be talking about today, I want to say, as folks know, if you listen to the intro, the Politics Guys, we're supposed to be a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate. And I feel like we've very consistently been those last two things, rational and civil. But lately, the bipartisan part, honestly, has been, really lacking. And that's because both of our, I'll call them our true conservatives, even Trey would say he's not a true conservative anymore, really. So May and Jay both went on work-related hiatuses. I guess that would be the word. I don't know. So let's go with that. Yeah, hiati. There you go. Anyway, but because we're not some big media podcast, we can't just sort of grab a, replacement level conservative, if you will, kind of off the shelf, kind of plug them in. For us, it's a process, and it tends to take a while. I get suggestions from people who I know I trust. Some of those suggestions turn into introductions, then those turn into conversations. And if I feel good about that, and also the person says, yeah, I'm willing to spend, 2.5 hours recording and for basically no money or fame or fortune. Well, it's hard to find people like that, but we're getting there. I think we're in the final stages. We actually have a conservative co-host potential plugged in for, at least penciled in for, I think, the end of the month. So we're hoping we're almost at the end of that. And how it typically works, and Justin, we did this, you'll recall this, we typically have a new host on with two of us. And then if that goes well, then listeners like it, we're comfortable, then we kind of do a one-on-one type of show. So that's our plan. May and Jay, their statuses are still up in the air. I mean, I hope they'll both be back. But whatever happens, I just wanted to let everyone know what was going on and that we're still 100% committed to the bipartisanship that, was a founding principle of the politics guys. And so until we found another regular conservative co-host, when I am hosting and there isn't a conservative, I will do my best to really kind of redouble my efforts to present the strongest conservative arguments. And the fact that I was an actual conservative for many years, and I spent several decades in a classroom sort of trying to steelman conservative policy arguments, I feel like I'm in a good position to do that, but I know it's not the same. I'm not going to pretend to be a conservative or anything like that. But anyway, that's kind of where we're at. And so with that update out of the way, I think we're ready to get with the actual politics. So Justin, what do you say we start with talking about, something we haven't talked about hardly at all these days, China and tariffs?
Yeah, so, this is definitely an ongoing story, and it seems to be fairly big news this week. Last week, Trump had announced a deal, and I'm making air quotes here, that was largely just, we'll probably keep talking to each other, and that was about it. But then at the beginning of this week, sort of surprisingly, felt like out of nowhere a little bit, announced that they had reached a deal where we were dropping our 145% tariffs on most things down to 30, which is still substantially more than they used to be, and China dropping its 125% retaliatory tariffs down to 10. This seems to have, at least in the short term, led to sort of a surge in orders and a possible return to some semblance of normal. Mike, do you think these are going to stick? Do you think this is, just kind of an ebb and flow in what has been an ebbing and flowing situation? Or does this represent something that might kind of hold on for a while and start to kind of stabilize that trade relationship a little bit?
Well, I've heard, I think, two main narratives on this. And the first, I think the most common one is, well, Donald Trump has backed down. This is how you deal with a bully like Trump. Was not going to back down, and Trump doesn't know how to handle that. And so he's backing down, pretending he's winning when he actually isn't. I don't know about that. I think there's something to it, but I think you can also argue for a second narrative. It's like, okay, so while markets are all still slightly down for the year since Donald Trump took office again, at least when I checked a couple of days ago, they're coming back up. And so you could say, well, this is maybe Donald Trump's plan all along. I mean, the whole art of the deal thing, right, is you start with this massive, ridiculous ask or first offer. So massive tariffs that bring every other country to the bargaining table. You end up with smaller but still significant tariffs. You come away with potentially hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions in foreign investment in the U.S. And because it's all being done through executive action instead of done through Congress, this is actually a feature, not a bug, because that means that President Trump can move really quickly in response to concessions that other countries might make, which Congress, of course, wouldn't be able to do. And so it's not exactly 3D chess because it's not that complicated. And I think you could construct that narrative and say, well, yeah, that seems reasonable based on what we know about Donald Trump. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm not surprised. Clearly, 145% was never going to happen for the long term. But it sure does seem to me like we get a slightly better deal out of this, at least in the interim, than China does. I mean, our tariffs on them are 30%, and that's that 10% baseline plus the 20% fentanyl. So, and also China agreed to lift their rare earth mineral export ban. So I don't know. I mean, you can see this as a victory for Donald Trump in a way. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic, I suppose, in that regard. I'm not sure, just given how much chaos there's been with these, they're up, they're down. I'm not entirely convinced that this is going to be a permanent state of affairs, kind of and, maybe your sort of second narrative is right that, hey, this is, kind of a grand bargain. I mean, it's basically the same as negotiating on a used minivan or something, as far as as far as the strategy goes. And I would agree it's not 3D chess, but I think one thing that has fed some confusion for me and makes me a little skeptical of what this is going to do going forward, is that the administration has been awfully said a lot of contradictory things about what the purpose of the tariffs are. And, they have explicitly, a couple of weeks ago, they had, various administration officials on the Sunday shows, and you have one guy saying, "Oh, these are permanent. It's not a negotiation thing," and somebody else saying, "Oh, this is about revenue," and somebody else saying, "Oh, this is a bargaining chip," and so on. And so, I suppose some of that is maybe to keep the Chinese guessing, and some of it is to keep maybe keep the cards a little close to the vest, but there does seem to be some confusion here about what this is for. I mean, maybe this is the end state that they were looking for, but, we had tariffs go up and go down, previously and then way up. And so, I'm just not sure. I'm a little surprised that the markets, frankly, haven't responded worse to this in some ways. This is, even the 145%, I mean, that is a huge hit on consumer spending and retail and things like that. And, you do see, Walmart saying, kind of even after this, that they're probably going to be raising prices on a lot of things, because it's going to cost them more. So, I'm not sure that we're out of the woods yet. And again, maybe, that 145 is shock and awe, not just to, the Chinese, but to Americans as well, so that, we kind of accept this higher level as a new normal. But I'm not entirely convinced that we're done with this yet.
Yeah, I actually, while I was painting that narrative, I think the longer term narrative is, well, we have not seen the effects of the inflation that are almost certain to come. That'll be sometime later on this summer. And so I think when that happens, and it depends on how much of the cost that sellers are actually willing to eat on that. And there's another that kind of goes in with another sort of tariff that we haven't talked about that I think has been sort of under discussed in this last week or so. And that was on the 14th earlier this week. The new de minimis tariff change went into effect. And previously there was what's called the de minimis exception. There was no tariff on overseas goods or goods from China up to $800. Well, that ended on Wednesday, the 14th. And now it's been replaced by either a 54% tariff per item or $100 per package. And to give you a sense of how big that is, around 2/3 of all U.S. de minimis imports come from China, although the average value of these things isn't that great. It's around $54. So they only account for maybe 10% of the total value of goods that China ships to the United States. But it's concentrated in certain sectors. And Justin, you and I are sort of part of one of those sectors, the inexpensive Chinese, we call them homage wristwatch market. And they're not knockoffs, but that's the sort of thing where, for instance, a brand like San Martin can make a watch for $200 that a Swiss company like Tudor would charge $5,000 for. Well, that's pretty attractive to people on limited incomes like the two of us. But if those San Martin watches go up by 54%, all of a sudden we're probably, especially given that that's not essential. Well, sometimes it feels like an essential item to me, but the pull of the addiction. But we're a lot more likely to just not buy that, essentially. So I think we'll start to see that. We haven't yet, and I think that's in part because a lot of these sellers are hoping that this will kind of blow over. They're going to try to hold the line on prices for as long as they can, but eventually we're going to start to see that, and we just haven't yet. And so what might seem like success for the Trump administration, what they can still plausibly argue as success, I think there might be a very different story when we look at the inflation numbers, when we look at the economic numbers in, 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, I think so. And the other thing is just, with some of this uncertainty, what people, how do you plan around this, is kind of a concern. I've got a friend who runs a small saxophone shop. I know all kinds of odd niche people.
I was going to say, there's a sentence I've never heard before, right?
Yeah. So, he's got sort of two lines. One is repairing saxophones, and the other is, he's basically kind of building custom ones. But that largely consists of sort of assembling mix and match parts, that are imported. And, he was telling me he has an order of, kind of like saxophone bodies that are just sort of sitting somewhere in China that, he doesn't know when they get here, how much they're going to be, and if he can order more, and, things like that. And, he was saying, look, this is a business that, we're little, but, I can't double my prices, on things, nobody's going to buy that. I can't source any of this stuff in the US because nobody's made saxophones in the US like from scratch since the mid 1950s. And, he's got 2 employees that, potentially are, going to be out of work, from this. So I think there are a lot of, smaller businesses that are very much going to be in a position like, my friend, where, this uncertainty just really makes it extremely difficult to do business. And, I know he called up somebody in the government, to talk about this, somebody kind of, trying to think which division, if it was the IRS or someplace, and basically they're like, yeah, we have no idea, what your tariff's going to be, when your stuff gets here. And, could be 0, it could be 150, we just don't know day to day. And, I think that's the other thing, along with, if 30% tariffs is going to guarantee inflation, I think you're absolutely right on that. But I do think, for an awful lot of companies, this uncertainty is going to be a real problem still, and I don't know, how you get around that, at least as long as Trump is president. It seems like, he could get a wild hair at any moment. And kind of back to your point, when you do things through Congress, there is something to be said there for that stability. It's very slow when you need to get stuff done, but, it is a system that promotes a kind of incremental change, which, I've always been a little bit of a fan of. And over the last 4 months or so, I've come to really appreciate, that way of doing government, because it does, these wild fluctuations just cause all kinds of problems.
Yeah, no, and I certainly think that given Donald Trump's history as an agent of chaos and his unpredictability, that certainly is one of the biggest problems, aside from just the nature of the tariffs themselves, because I tend to be pretty at least I am anti sort of sweeping tariffs. I'm fine for selective tariffs for national security reasons, that sort of thing. But apparently now everything is an emergency for national security. And so therefore the president can do essentially anything, which is a very convincing doctrine to you if you're the president, I'm sure.
It's a fantastic doctrine. I'm not sure that, fast fashion imports really are a matter of national security.
Yeah. Well, Temu and Shein might have something else to say about that, but yeah. All right. So any more thoughts on this before we move on, Justin?
I feel like I've probably said my piece. We've talked about tariffs a lot in here. The funny thing, I feel like this is one where you, me, and Jay all have a pretty strong consensus.
Yeah, definitely. We don't have a whole lot of super protectionist type folks. So.
Hey, it's Mandy Moore.
Sterling K. Brown.
And Chris Sullivan from That Was Us.
Spring is finally here. And if you're like us, you're looking for little ways to bring new energy into your home, starting with your bed.
I love everything about Brooklinen. I love the variety of colors. I love the texture. I love the coolness up against my skin. I'm a man who runs hot. These sheets keep your boy cool, and I love them.
Brooklinen makes it so easy to refresh your space with layers that feel light, breathable, and so comfortable. Finding sheets you love can be tricky, but Brooklinen nails it every time.
Brooklinen offers so many different tones and textures, which is great, since new colors can make your bedroom feel fresh and inviting. Plus, their lightweight, airy fabrics are perfect for sun-kissed mornings and cozy nights.
And the best part? Brooklinen has everything you need, from soft sheets to the perfect throw blankets to style and layer your bed effortlessly.
It's no wonder they have over 100,000 five-star reviews. People love them. So if you're ready to refresh your space, now is the time.
Shop award winners and fan faves in-store and online at brooklinen.com. That's BROOKLINEN.com. Get 15% off your first order today.
All right, well, why don't we move on then to Donald Trump's big Middle East trip?
Yeah, so certainly one of the sort of obligations or duties of a president is to, go abroad and meet with foreign dignitaries and conduct foreign policy. This last week, Trump made his first trip to the Middle East. He's done it a few times in his previous presidency. This time, the focus is largely on commerce. So things like, getting Qatar to commit to buying some Boeing airplanes and, investment in research parks and things like that. Not much discussion of human rights, et cetera, which is often fairly typical of interactions with these regimes. Apart from the flying palace discussion, which I think you guys talked about some last week, really probably the most discussed announcement seems to be the end of sanctions on Syria, which has been a decades-long situation. Even some Democrats seem to think that, this was an idea whose time had come. What do you think, I guess, were the most consequential things that came out of this trip? And, does any of this signal sort of a shift with U.S. Middle Eastern relations, any tensions there, et cetera?
This is going to sound weird because people are going to be saying, well, geez, Mike, I know you said you were going to maybe try to focus on more conservative arguments, but it seems like you're just abandoning the left. But I got to say, on this story, I see a strategy here, and I'm almost kind of impressed, corruption aside. Of course, it's massive corruption. Can we put that aside? Well, let's hold off on that for a second. But I think you can actually, at this point, make a good case that Donald Trump has done more than any U.S. president since Jimmy Carter with the Camp David Accords in 1979 to really bring substantive change to the Middle East, or at least make that a real possibility. Now, of course, there's Gaza. So if say putting aside, Gaza and massive corruption, but if we do look at this whole kind of thing, what he's doing weirdly for Donald Trump seems not chaotic to me, but kind of even more coherent than what I've seen from any other U.S. president since I started seriously following politics. And that's been a long time. I mean, it seems like I see it as number one, support Israel. Number two, isolate Iran. And number three, use economic carrots to incentivize those other Middle Eastern countries to move away from Iran and toward normalized relations with Israel. And I don't know, it sure seems like at least it looks promising. I'm not going to say it's worked. I mean, if someone could solve the Middle East, my God, but it sure seems like there's some movement that we haven't seen in a long time. And so I got to give him credit. This seems like a reasonable strategy to me. Now, on the Syria thing, I'm a little confused about that as well. I'm maybe not confused, but I mean, Syria is still listed as a state sponsor of terrorism. There are only 4 countries that are listed, and that's our own Department of State: Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Syria. And the Syrian president's still designated a terrorist because he's got ties to Al Qaeda. So should the president be lifting sanctions and meeting with a designated known terrorist? Well, God knows if Joe Biden or Barack Obama did it, the right would have been Tucker Carlson probably would have had an aneurysm right on screen, or right on the air. But I don't know. It help me out here. Am I drinking the Kool-Aid here? Have I read too much of the Wall Street Journal this week? I don't know, but talk to me here. What do you think?
On some level, I'm not far off where you are, in the sense that, I don't think it's awful, mostly. I think where I have some concerns, I mean, the Syria thing, I definitely have some concerns there. If we go back, thinking about kind of, the Bush era, I thought we maybe went too far the other way in terms of demanding concessions before we'd sit down with people. I think sitting down and talking is generally pretty good. I do have some concerns here, in terms of, are we getting enough, out of this, or is this as much of an accomplishment? And, I think your case for, sort of building, icing out Iran, I think that's a plausible story. On the other hand, so much of this sort of feels like just business stuff, and it just seems to gloss over a lot of other serious issues is sort of my concern. A lot of these countries have really dreadful human rights records. And, I think, we're not really making any sort of demands there. It's just, hey, come over here and we'll make sure you buy some airplanes and let's keep you away from Iran a little bit. And, that's all well and good, but I'm not sure. I mean, maybe this is a first step. Maybe this is, kind of a baby step towards some things. But, I do have some concerns with, sort of normalizing relations with people who are, some of them not the best, to put it mildly.
Well,
without maybe trying to get a little more out of them. Go ahead.
I'd say it's hard to find good actors in the Middle East just in general, given the nature of Middle Eastern politics. And I guess I'll say...
I mean, if any of these guys go, I mean, the next person that steps into the vacuum is probably worse, so, yeah.
But I mean, with Syria, right, the new guy just came in at the beginning of this year after decades of horrific Assad leadership, right? And then that's why, I mean, Syria's been on that list, I think, since the late 70s. And so he is a very different sort of guy. And I don't know, I think you can make the case, new regime, it feels different. But yeah, there's a tension here between if we demand, perfect human rights records and perfect purity from our allies or people who we are willing to do business with, then we end up not doing business with hardly anyone. But then again, you're right. We just don't want to say, well, it doesn't matter what you do as long as we can cut a deal with you. And so I think in the end, I feel like the Trump administration has gone too far the other way. As opposed to, I mentioned Jimmy Carter. Carter was probably too far in the direction of, well, we want to make sure that you are, you are living up to our values in your country. And that's a bit presumptuous to say the least, but it bothers me on a number of levels. Go ahead.
And to be fair, I mean, I probably prefer this to kind of that Bush strategy where, you have to give us, 80% of what we want before we even talk to you. That seems sort of unproductive. So I think it's a step in the right direction. But.
Yeah. And so I think it leans into Donald Trump's sense of himself as the ultimate deal maker. I mean, he's shown he's willing to talk to all sorts of people. He believes he can come out of these things with deals. But yeah, in the end, I don't know. But if this works out in any way, certainly there has been talk about Donald Trump being nominated for a Nobel Prize. He was back in 2020 when he was the one sort of negotiating the Abraham Accords. And now he's trying to get a bunch of other countries. He said Saudi Arabia, he's urged them to go into it, but he said, well, you'll do it in your own time. And if he can actually do that, get a couple of other countries to sign on, I think he can make a sort of ridiculous case that he should win or should be seriously considered for that. And I know that's hard for a lot of folks to take. I don't like Donald Trump. I don't think he's a good guy, but sometimes bad guys can do good things, even maybe despite themselves. I don't know. But speaking of bad guys, maybe we should talk about the other part of this that is seriously bad guy, old time corrupt oligarchy sort of thing, right? The jet. And so, I mean, on the jet, so somewhere, I mean, it's said it's around $400 million, I think, that the Qataris, the value of it, it's used. And so, it depreciates a little bit. So call it somewhere between $250 and $400 million. And I, like almost everyone who's not Donald Trump and his inner circle, find this to be completely beyond the pale, especially the part where, well, let's see, it goes to the Department of Defense, then it becomes Air Force One, assuming they can get it ready in time for the end of the Trump administration, which is questionable because they basically have to strip it down to essentially the studs because they have to worry about listening devices and other things and put all this other stuff in. Might not be available much before the new Boeing Air Force One. And oh, by the way, after the administration is over, it's going to be then turned over to the Trump Presidential Library, where Donald Trump at one point, I think, said, well, it will just be an exhibit. And I find that incredibly hard to believe. I think it's a lot more likely that it's going to be Donald Trump's essentially de facto private jumbo jet post-presidential Air Force One. And boy, that stinks to high heaven as far as I'm concerned. What do you think?
Or he might just leave it to rot like a 757.
Yeah.
But, I mean, this is just indefensible. on so many grounds. I think the corruption angle is huge. And, the defenses I've seen of this are tremendously weak, comparing it to the gift of the Statue of Liberty, things like that. I mean, it's just, come on. That just strains credulity on so many levels. I really agree with everything you've got. I mean, it's explicitly in the Constitution that, you can't take gifts, from foreign countries, on now, I guess, the issue here would be, the gifts to the country are one thing and gifts to the president are another. It's incredibly hard for me to see how this is not a gift to the president, even if it is technically, owned by the Department of Defense. I mean, this is, his plane for his, his well-being, his use exclusively, et cetera. And especially that transfer bit at the end. I mean, that's come on.
If it weren't for that, I think you could argue that it's not as plausibly just complete corruption. I mean, Donald Trump, after this happened, posted, why should our military and our taxpayers therefore be forced to pay hundreds of millions of dollars when they can get it for free? Only a fool would not accept this gift on behalf of our country. And I'd say, okay, sure. But then there's the Trump Presidential Library thing, and there's just no working around that sort of thing. If they had said, well, at the end, then it stays with the Air Force as because there's always a backup Air Force One or something like that. Okay, fine. But that's not what's going on.
It provides a level of plausible deniability, at least.
Yeah,
that's really not here. And I just the practicalities of this are. I mean, it's.
And what's the look that we're taking Air Force One, this great symbol of American power and prestige, and we have to actually take it as a gift from another country? That's just kind of sort of sad. I know Donald Trump sees it differently. Apparently, he sees it as, well, dictator Xi is flying around in the coolest, new, most opulent model of this variant of the 747. I've got this crappy 30-year-old version, and it's just embarrassing. People are laughing at me behind my back, sort of thing. And no, I mean, seriously, that's what White House insiders apparently have been, because he's so insecure about that type of thing. But I think it looks far worse that we have to accept it as a gift from the Qataris than, anyway. But
well, and then, along with that, I mean, one of the stories that came out this week is that, this isn't that new of a plane, and they've been trying to unload it for years. Like nobody will buy the damn thing. And so, I'm not sure, that you wouldn't be. I mean, this is one of those things that's going to sound terrible, but, if we take the $400 million, I mean, as the budget goes, and as frankly the cost of putting together an Air Force One goes, that's kind of a drop in the bucket. It's as far as the bottom line goes, it's really not that important. It seems to me that you could buy, for $400 million, you could buy, retired Northwest 740. Northwest, geez, Delta, 747. Delta, most of the American airlines have quit flying 747s. I mean, there's got to be, a comparable one floating around, and I guess it doesn't have the opulent, again, air quotes, opulent interior. But like you said, I mean, they've got to tear this thing apart, anyway, to get it back up to spec. Redoing the cabin wouldn't be a huge deal either. So I'm not even sure, at some level, I feel like with Trump, it's just that he wants to get stuff out of people. It's not even that he needs that, we're going to kiss your ass by giving you a plane. We're going to kiss your ass by, bringing the mobile McDonald's command post to the airport and, things like that. I mean, it's just, I mean, for gosh sakes, Trump, off, kind of his crypto stuff. He's got $400 million loose dollars if he wanted to play in that bad. It's that, it's the act of I want somebody to tell me how great I am by giving me stuff, sort of thing. And I just, the corruption angle, the practicalities of it, the timing. I mean, it's going to take years. It would take years to set this right. I mean, it's just, it stinks.
Yeah. And it seems to me that, it's not seems to me, it's not just us. It's not just people on the left, center left who are concerned about this. Plenty of very prominent MAGA folks have called this out, saying this is not okay. That Qatar is not our friend, and they're actually fairly friendly with Iran. Now, that's a big part of the reason why Qatar is friendly with Iran is that they share ownership of the South Pars North Dome gas field, which is, like, by a long shot the largest natural gas field in the world. And so there's that, but still, they're not exactly a cuddly sort of place. We diverge from them in a number of ways, and so it also kind of goes against, in some ways, that strategy I talked about earlier that I see about isolating Iran and friends of Iran and that kind of thing. Or you could argue that it does. So, but I think you're right. The sort of things that drive Donald Trump that make him such a good politician or so attracted to some people, I think, can really be his Achilles heel, his love for stuff and opulence, and to show and to be feted and to get, that sort of thing, just really, I think, is such a strong drive in him, at least it appears to be, that I think it can override just basic common sense or ideas of propriety, because but it looks like this is going to go through. And that just, I guess it blows my mind in a way. And I think it's been suggested that, Donald Trump is at least upfront about all this. And that's really all we expect these days. I guess our standards of corruption are so low as that it's okay if you're corrupt, according to at least some folks who are defending Trump. But if you're transparent about it, it's not really corruption. It's just, hey, you're wetting your beak a little bit. You're making a little bit of money, but it's not affecting you anyway. So what if you're just savvy? What's wrong with being savvy? That's why we elected him, to be savvy.
Yeah, and that kind of argument really bothers me.
Yeah, me too.
That no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's flying out there, it's only corruption if it's done in the dark or something. And my God, I mean, if you're just so corrupt that you'll just do it out in the open, I don't think that's an improvement, by any stretch. This all reminds me, Bob Dole had a quip on campaign finance. I'm probably mangling it slightly, but the gist of it was, when people donate to campaigns, they're not trying to buy good government.
Exactly. Yeah.
And, and I've always really respected that line, and I think that very much applies here. I mean, you're not just giving the guy a plane, come on, there's just no way that this is without some expectation. Maybe there's not a direct quid pro quo in terms of we want X out of this. Boy, it for sure is about greasing the wheels. I mean, there's got to be an expectation here on Qatar's part. Getting something out of this.
I get the sense. I get the sense that Donald Trump truly and honestly believes that this is being done to sort of acknowledge his wonderfulness. And like I said, these countries coming to him as supplicants. And I think he honestly believes that this will not affect how he thinks about anything. And that's, of course, I think Donald Trump has plenty of tragic flaws, but that I think is I think he is completely oblivious to how manipulable he is. And that's a tragic flaw to have in anyone, but particularly in the president of the United States.
I wanted to circle back to something a little bit, actually, in terms of kind of the overall kind of the trip again. And one thing that was sort of striking to me, and I think the jet is a symptom of that, as is the McDonald's truck. I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, me too.
But I feel like the Middle Eastern leaders have a better read, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but have a better read on how to play him than most other world leaders. If you look at kind of all of this trip, they are very good at sort of flattery and pampering and such. And, because kind of what you've said about, Trump being sort of manipulable, I do wonder if this isn't, kind of bizarrely setting up kind of some sort of, global reordering, of a sort. Europe doesn't seem to want to play ball with him in the same way, or doesn't want to suck up to him in the same way. And I do wonder if this doesn't have, bigger consequences than we think, kind of on the face of it. We've done, I think, a lot of damage not the we that's the administration, has done a lot of damage to kind of our relations with our traditional allies. And it seems like just through this kind of interpersonal stuff, a lot of these, kind of formerly hostile countries are really making some inroads.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, because I feel like there's sort of two things that play into each other. Donald Trump's love for opulence and flattery and that sort of thing. And I feel like almost in a sense, there's a way, and I don't want to overstate it or be culturally, I don't know, make sort of straw men or insensitive, but I feel like oftentimes in Middle Eastern culture, there's maybe a little bit more of those sort of things that are just naturally that sort of opulence. And there's much more of I feel like there's less of that in sort of Western European traditions now, whatever, Louis XIV, that sort of thing. But I think maybe they're right to sort of the austerity of Brussels and all that, as opposed to, like the lavishness of, I think that a lot of people associate with the Gulf states and the Middle East in general. And I think Donald Trump loves that kind of thing. He sees those blingy planes and all that stuff. And not only that, but it's a region that's full of authoritarians, which means that he can just make a deal with a guy, essentially. And it's always a guy, basically. And I think he's on much more comfortable ground than dealing with third parties, whether it's a legislature in his own country or, having to worry about whether or not the president or the prime minister of some Western European democracy can actually get their legislature to go along with something that he wants to do.
Yeah, you go to the sheik and that's that. I've always, from the get-go, I've always had the sense that these are the kind of folks that Trump wants to be, on some level, which, rather than kind of the full-on fascism, and Jay and I had talked about this some a while back, but, and it's not so that I don't think he's got, some real problems on that front potentially, but that I always felt like it was kind of like, third world or Middle Eastern, dictator aspirations, more of a kleptocracy, kind of thing, that a lot of these leaders that he's dealing with, I mean, it's almost kind of aspirational for him, on some level.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's dead on. I think Donald Trump's ideal would be to sort of reside in some sort of, kind of stately pleasure dome and occasionally just sort of come forth with great pronouncements and things, and the people would bow down and cheer and clap. He doesn't want to do the work, but it's sort of a.
Actually, as you're describing this, this seems like something I would.
Oh yeah, I'm all for living in a stately pleasure dome, But
I don't think I want to live under that regime.
No, exactly.
Gosh, if I could be at the top of it, this doesn't sound half bad.
It's good to be the king or what have you. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so why don't we, not exactly move on, because we're talking about, people in stately pleasure domes, and there's always kind of sort of corruption involved in that. And, just a few days actually before Donald Trump took office for his second term, he launched a meme coin. And for people who don't know, that's a cryptocurrency that comes out of some internet meme or something with the symbol $Trump. And now, technically, it's the creation of World Liberty Financial, but the Trump family owns a controlling stake in it, so it all kind of ties back there. And the Trump organization owns something like 80% of the coins. The other 20% had been made available for public purchase. And unlike political contributions, which have to be disclosed, neither World Liberty Financial nor the Trump organization have to publicly report who owns these Trump coins. And, that's kind of the point of crypto, is you provide a secure, anonymous way to transfer funds. And so the Trump organization makes money on this through the initial coin sale, of course, then through trading fees on every trade, and also, of course, if traders drive the value of coins up. And lately, they found another way to make money on this by selling access. On April 23rd, it was when the Trump coin website announced a contest where the top 220 holders of the coin, they get an exclusive dinner with President Trump at his golf club. And now 220 people with an exclusive dinner, I guess. Okay, whatever. But the top 25, they got invites to an exclusive reception before the exclusive dinner and a special VIP tour. Now, that resulted in the value of Trump coins going up somewhere around 40% in the weeks that followed until May 12th when the contest ended. And, while the Trump organization and its entities, they aren't required to release information on who owns these, there are some instances in which we can find out at least a little bit. For instance, this week, I think this is an underreported story. A company called the GDP Culture Group made a securities filing. In it, they announced they had secured money to buy up to $300 million worth of both Trump and Bitcoins. Now, what is GD Culture? Well, it's a Chinese company. They focus on TikTok. They have 8 employees and no reported revenue for 2024. Oh, and bigger, they secured their funding for this, according to them in the filing, through a stock sale, through an undisclosed entity in the British Virgin Islands, which is, of course, a very popular place for people who want. Now, that's right. I mean, you're laughing because all of this sounds, I think, more than a little bit shady to a lot of folks. And in fact, the bigger picture is that people have been arguing that this sort of thing just opens the floodgates to potentially massive corruption, allows in all sorts of shady actors to basically indirectly funnel money to the Trump organization, presumably with the expectation they'll get something for it. Like you said, Justin, it's not like Qatar's not giving a $200, $300, $400 million plane away for nothing. And these folks presumably are not investing in the Trump meme coin because they think it's a fantastic investment. If they are, well, there's a serious question there. But anyway, so the stablecoin market in general, though, here's some more, right? For those you don't know, stablecoin is a cryptocurrency that they peg it to some sort of reference asset to minimize the kind of wild swings that we've seen in other cryptocurrencies. And that's what the Trump coin is. But it's still very new. It's not a very well-regulated market. And congressional Republicans thought they were going to pass a measure in this last week to make it less of a kind of a Wild West environment. There's a bill called the Genius Act that would have provided increased safeguards for stablecoin consumers and greater oversight to make it harder to use stablecoins for money laundering. And it seemed like this is on track for passage, which, God, in Congress these days, that's pretty rare. But at the last minute, a number of Democrats withdrew their support because they said, well, this legislation doesn't do really anything to address the risks of public officials profiting from stablecoins in a way just like the way I kind of sketched out there. And so what Democrats first did is they tried to work with Republicans to get amendments added to the Genius Act to address their corruption concerns. That didn't go anywhere. So then they announced their own proposal. They call it the End Crypto Corruption Act, which would ban elected officials and their families from owning, trading, or promoting crypto assets and make illegal the sort of contest that the Trump coin did, tying promotions to the purchase of crypto assets. And oh, by the way, it's estimated right now that Donald Trump has made around $2.9 billion from his crypto ventures, and crypto now makes up around 40% of his net worth. So, wow, there's a lot there. What are your thoughts on this, Justin?
Seems like you could buy a 747 with it. my initial thought. Honestly, you've said it so well. I don't know how much I have to add to this story. I think I've always been tremendously skeptical of crypto across the board. And full disclosure, I put a little bit of money into it a couple of years ago and lost about $40. So, you can assess my stance on that depending on how much you think $40 means to me. That is full disclosure, however, which is the problem with so much of this, is that it's all very shady. And I do think that this intersection of crypto and politics is setting us up for some really bad stuff. I've just to pull back a little bit. I think in general, I've been very skeptical of, crypto as anything other than pretty much a Ponzi scheme for the most part. Even the big ones, they're too volatile to be a currency, but, they're really, then there's no underlying value to them particularly. If they're not a currency, then what are they for? We're just kind of trading chits back and forth and whatnot. So, which isn't to say I didn't try to make my fortune on it, briefly, but, I think the intersection of that with politics is because it is so opaque, and it's opaque by design. The whole point of Bitcoin to go, sort of way back was to sort of have sort of this asset currency, whatever, that's sort of beyond regulation, that evades traditional safeguards on, transfers of money, et cetera. And, I think it's a tool of money laundering and, drug dealing and, things of that nature. You throw this in here and it's a perfect way for political corruption, and I suppose the part that's maybe a bit of a safeguard is there is some anonymity there. But when you have, this Trump dinner thing, again, I suppose his defense is that, well, I'm doing this out in the open or whatever. But, it is just mind-boggling to me that you're just specifically selling access. I mean, there's no other way to look at this than that. If you buy enough of this, you get to come to my tacky golf club and have dinner with me. There's just, we've undercut so many campaign finance things anyway, but there was always this logic that, look, we don't want to be doing things like this. We don't want to be sort of putting, too much corrupting money into the process. And this is just a spigot of that. It goes back to the phrase that I see periodically on the internet, but, Jimmy Carter put his peanut farm in a blind trust. And, we're so far from that at this point that it's just galling.
Yeah. I can only imagine if, say, 3 days before Joe Biden took office in 2020, Hunter Biden had come up with a Biden crypto coin, and we had found out that a company with ties to Ukraine had planned to buy hundreds of millions of dollars worth of it. Now, I'm willing to bet that the House Oversight Committee would have taken a very different view of that than Comer and company are now, basically saying, well, it's all out in the open. As you point, it's not. I mean, the fact that it's being done is, but who exactly is investing in this is not. And so to me, I look at this and I think, are we at the point now where basically, again, we've just become numb to corruption, that essentially there's so much of it happening so often that people just dismiss it. Whereas if the administration were less openly grasping for money with every single thing they do for Donald Trump, not for, if maybe it would actually be worse for them. And it's better just to kind of continue on and just act like all of this is completely okay and normal. It fits into the great businessman mystique, and the MAGA faithful will say, well, it certainly would never influence his decision. So there's nothing wrong, again, with being a savvy businessman, a little entrepreneurial spirit. Hey, he started this before he was president. He can make some money on it. Good on him.
The other thing, apart from the corruption, is it's just also tacky. I mean, he's got so many tchotchkes and whatnot, he's just selling so much branded stuff. It just, setting aside the corruption, which is a huge set aside, but it's just so crass and tacky. It just really kind of cheapens the dignity of the office, which I think is also really a problem for me. I mean, I don't know. I'm just sputtering now.
On that point, sometimes I wonder to what extent my distaste, if you will, for Donald Trump and all of his works, as it were, is aesthetic in nature. And if he didn't have the tacky orange spray tan and sell the tacky watches and the steaks and just this sad, pathetic little gaudy, failed businessman, essentially, who would have ended up having a lot more money if he just put the hundreds of millions that daddy gave him into an index fund as opposed to doing all this weird stuff. How much of that is driving how I feel about him on substantive matters? Because I share that too. I just look at him and what he surrounds himself with and how he sort of tackified, the White House, or at least the Oval Office. And I just think, ew. And maybe but then I think, but there is something to cheapening the office. And there's a difference between tackiness and out what feels like corruption. Not what feels like corruption, what I find hard to see, and even the most charitable is anything other than corruption. And so there's a lot I have to try to disentangle when I deal with Donald Trump on a policy level, I guess.
I feel like there's almost like three levels of this, on some. I mean, there's the tackiness, which is like, all that gold stuff in the Oval Office and, whatever. I mean, that's a choice. But I do think there is, something maybe beyond tacky, but not even necessarily the corruption angle. Just, the government is the president as a tchotchke salesman. It just seems cheap. The big issue, though, the substantive issue is why is this Chinese company that probably is trying to keep TikTok alive, spending $300 billion on stable coins? I mean, so I think, to me, I think it's not just the optics of it, but more or not just the kind of aesthetics of it, but the aesthetics are galling too.
Well, the idea that there wouldn't even be a House Oversight Committee investigation into this when they've launched investigations under what I would argue much thinner grounds for the Biden family investigation, or sometimes called the Biden crime family. There will be an investigation if Democrats take the House, certainly. So I think an investigation is coming. It's just going to take a couple of years. And I think when that does happen, we're going to see all kinds of stuff that will not surprise us at all, that the administration will say is either perfectly okay or fake news, and that pretty much 30 to 40% of the public will dismiss as just Trump derangement syndrome.
The other part of this, I mean, we've been on this theme of, he's pitching it as, well, it's out in the open, so how bad can it be? It does make me wonder what else is going on not out in the open, is sort of the other part of this. If anyone were to dig in, which, I think you're right, eventually somebody will.
And I think too that obviously there are people in the administration who have a vested interest in finding ways to not just normalize, but essentially legally approve what we see as corruption. Like, for instance, in the Qatari jet thing, which we talked about earlier, Pam Bondi said, the Attorney General said, yeah, this seems like legally okay. But, of course, this is somebody who, before she worked for President Trump, worked for a company that was prominent lobbyist for the Qatari government. And so you start unpeeling this sort of stuff or peeling it back, and it just gets really, really questionable awfully quickly.
It feels swampy, if you will.
But I don't think Donald Trump ever cared about draining the swamp so much. I think he just cared about sort of draining the parts of the swamp that were keeping him from doing the stuff he wanted to do. And that's what most of us want to do when we talk, let's clear away that awful regulation and these problematic rules. Well, they're problematic to the extent that they keep us from doing the things we want. There are very few people, I think, who come into office and say, well, let's really clear away all this stuff that leads to unfettered executive power. It's like the Calvin Coolidges of the world are not going to be elected president anymore. So, any other thoughts on this sort of Trump corruption, sort of crypto corruption thing?
No, but I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to revisit this somewhere in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I expect you're right. Well, on that, why don't we close? If there's anything we talked about on the episode that you want to hold forth about, let us know. You can do that through our email, mail@politicsguys.com, Facebook and X as well. Links are always in the show notes. And of course, there's our Discord discussion forum for supporters. I'm on that all the time. And, if there's anything that you want to, talk with us about, the Discord forum is really great. And of course, that's available just to supporters. And if you're not a supporter, we hope you'll consider becoming one. You get access to that, a bunch of other things. You can find the support links, as always, in the show notes. And if you want to get access to our full midweek show, which supporters get, as opposed to just that 15-minute or so preview, but you're not in a position to financially support the show, let me know. I'm at mike@politicsguys.com. I'll be happy to get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really helps us out a lot if you subscribe, rate and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, before we go, as always, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Brian Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,